So, what does it mean for a fragrance to be a shell of its former self? How do we determine that? Do we just rely on the opinion of somebody else and just run with it? Do we make an assessment ourselves? Do we do a comparison? And how do we come to that conclusion? What is it that we notice has changed from one version of a fragrance to another that leads us to that conclusion that it has been hollowed out? This video, we're going to explore that a little bit. And I am also going to cite some examples of some fragrances where, in my personal opinion, they have changed considerably in recent years through subsequent formulations. But it isn't really to say that the new version is completely unwearable or unacceptable, though in some instances that is argued, but that there are some notable changes from just how I perceive them. So we'll get things started. And I think the one that always comes to mind for me is the classic from the 80s that has now been relegated to rack stores and shows up for $12. That is none other than Puig Quorum. There are already a number of videos on Quorum. So this is not really new terrain on YouTube, but I think it would be important to bring this one up because I think that it is so unfairly maligned based on these more recent versions that are in this particular box and in this particular bottle. So in my opinion, something happened along the way where a lot of what makes this fragrance have a core and a base has been drastically pared back. So here's the new bottle of Quorum. And if you notice, there's some slight stylistic changes as well. So I have the older bottle that I think it might be from the 90s, early 90s, maybe older. I don't have the box with me, but I'll show that right now. It's buried somewhere, stored with other boxes. But here's the old one, and here's the new one. So my lighting isn't perfect, but if you notice, there's some slight differences in even the font. So if you look at, if I can, let's see if I can do this. Let's see if I can coordinate myself to do this. All right. So if you can see that a little bit, there's slight difference. The one thing that you can notice is the difference with the M. The M is actually a little bit flared out in the newer bottle. The font looks a little bit different as well. And we also notice Eau de Toilette is in lowercase rather than caps. You also see at the bottom, it is printed on the older bottle. If you can check that out there, Antonio Puig. So these are just some visual cues. Of course, as many of you know who are enthusiasts of collecting and enjoying vintages, you may see that there is a UPC symbol or a barcode. And that doesn't always mean it's inferior by any means, but it does give you an indication that the fragrance was at least produced in the 90s or so. And then the ingredients list. So the ingredients list has changed over time. The ingredients list would be quite simple for many, many years and would probably just list the denatured alcohol, aqua, and parfum. Maybe a couple of other things that would be added later on due to changes in regulations. You'd start to see things like benzophenone and a few other things. But the real changes started to occur at about 2002, 2003. And that is around the time that we had a number of fragrance materials that were determined to be potential allergens. So those were included as well. And this list has increased, has changed, has modified. Things have been added. Things that were there have been removed. It's never really a good indicator of whether or not something is in there or no longer in there. Because it could just very well mean that from year to year, regulations require that it's listed, or do they no longer require that it's listed. It could go back and forth. And this has been going on since 2002, with the most significant changes in restrictions and changes through IFRA in about 2013, and that's when you would really start to see a much longer ingredients list. And you can see some examples here. Some of them include citronellol, geraniol, citral, isoeugenol, hydroxycitronellol. That is used to create a floral feel. It's a great modifier, and it fleshes out a fragrance. It's most famously used for Muguet, Lily of the Valley Accords. Benzyl benzoate, which is mostly a solvent, but it also does add some aromatic changes to a fragrance. And the beloved Auvergne prunastri, which is oak moss. Here, it lists the substitute for that, which is still a pretty effective material. I wouldn't knock it. It is Auvergne furfuracea, which is tree moss extract. And that is an indicator that it's still used in some capacity in this version, however old it might be. I don't think it's very old, the newer version of Quorum. So the older version of Quorum that I have with the box that I couldn't locate in a timely manner does have a much shorter ingredients list because it was produced in the 90s. But I have to stress that when you look at this ingredients list, you have to look at it as a list of what has been deemed potential allergens or potentially harmful when worn at a given time. It doesn't tell you much more than that. It's not telling you the exhaustive ingredients list either, because for those ingredients, there are scores more that are not subjected to that requirement. So that's just a word of advice with that. But yes, if you do see a short ingredients list does mean that that fragrance had been produced most likely before 2002. And then a barcode before the 90s. Don't know the exact year. Most likely you have in your possession a fragrance from the 80s or earlier. But I do agree that Quorum had a huge impact, especially in its dry down. I think that it is unfairly maligned based on how it is judged in current days. I wouldn't say that it is horrible currently, but it's a little thin. It leaves much to be desired, I think, and is a poor representation of what this fragrance had been for many years prior to these significant changes. So the good news about Quorum is that vintages do not go for very much money. I think I spent no more than $35 or $40 on this 1.7 fluid ounce. Granted, that's not $12, but still, that is not very expensive for a vintage fragrance. So if you want to explore what Quorum was really like in, at least the first 3 decades of its existence, I would recommend getting an older version of it. And, there are some other examples of this too. Another, which is sort of, in a similar vein as far as an early 80s aromatic chypre leathery kind of hybrid from the early 80s is we have Jacques Bogart. Jacques Bogart, one-man show. Huge difference between older versions and the newer version, which also seems rather hollowed out as well and abrasive and tinny. I guess tinny would be the right word. There's just trebly. There's no bass anymore in it. And the older versions, perhaps it's due to these restrictions, that prior to the restrictions, there was a little bit more liberty to use certain materials in the base that give it that heft. Or it was just a decision to not really invest much of the money or energy into using replacers that would retain the feel, the texture, the overall scent profile, the overall integrity, because that's something to consider as well. It's not, I don't think it's going to necessarily always have to do with just the restriction of materials. It could just be, whoever's producing it is trying to cut corners, trying to get away with what they can, spending as little money as possible while still capitalizing on a brand. So that's something to consider as well. But this is another example. I think that this one is, unfortunately, in its newer versions, a shell of its former self. Another Halston Z14. Halston Z14, another rack store favorite. Another one that you can get for, a song, a little ditty. And this one has some very synthetic spiciness. It's like very cinnamic. And the base is really, it's a shadow of what it used to be when it dries down. It's not horrible. It's just, it isn't representative of how it, how it was. This dries down with just this beautiful resinous, leathery accord with a bit of spiciness and a bit of a punchiness to it. And you just don't find that in the newer versions of it. And yet another, Atsaro Purim, a big difference in the newer versions of Atsaro Purim. Atsaro Purim, released in 1978, is this wonderfully aromatic anisec fougere. And it's the same complaint I have. It feels like it's been thinned out. Not even the anisec quality isn't as robust even. And forget about the dry down. There's just no substance to it. It just, I don't know what happened. I think that it could have something to do with IFRA regulations. It could have to do with, cutting corners, or it could just have to simply do with just some poor decision making, poor business. What do we do in this situation? Do we lay it to rest? Do we just retire this fragrance? Or is there somebody who will step in and try to revive it? Who knows? But it's all business. These decisions, they're about making money. And even if it results in their losing money or not making money, it's there's nothing that we can do about it. It's just, once again, thankfully with Atsaro Purim, you don't have to spend a ton for an older version of it. And yet another one that is considered a potential casualty is Yves Saint Laurent Opium. Here's the eau de toilette. And the newer version, particularly in the more rectangular bottle with the window in the middle, has certain things about it that's sort of sharp, not very rounded, not very voluptuous like this classic used to be. And, it's sad. It's really sad. But I don't know exactly what that stems from. Once again, it's a number of theories. It could have to do with restrictions in materials. Eugenol, isoeugenol. There's a lot of that was in it. Maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe it had to do with other spice materials. Maybe it had to do with floral materials. But, Yves Saint Laurent seems to have a tendency to not respect its classic fragrances in its portfolio. And that's pretty sad because, this is iconic. Who's to say that might not change in the future? But that's why, folks tend to want to obtain the older versions of this, whether it's the built-in sprayer or a bottle like this. Knowing, Estee Lauder Knowing is quite a gregarious personality of a fragrance. Beautiful stuff. But that gregariousness seemed a little stifled in newer bottles. It's recognizably knowing, but seems to know a little bit less than it used to. So it's just another example that I think that, it's been compromised a great deal. Something that is just so bold and so supple and complex of a fragrance, to see it sort of a little bit simplified to satisfy whom, the loyal knowing wearer. Some might think that's a little bit of an insult for somebody who's loved this fragrance and wants to continue wearing it, or they might rely on their not really noticing over time. But, there are going to be people who will eventually make a comparison. Or they'll read it somewhere like, oh, yeah, I compared an old version with a new version. It's not the same. So. And then there are others where I don't necessarily have proof, but I've heard plenty. Like, this is Boss, Hugo Boss. Before it was number one. Some people say it hasn't changed too much, except maybe the performance has changed. Performance, I don't really get into that as much. It's hard to really have some scientific measurement, this solid concrete proof that something isn't performing as well as it did before, because things just perform differently depending upon the person, depending upon the conditions, depending upon the time of year, maybe even depending on bottle to bottle, who knows. But smell-wise, I'm inclined to agree that maybe it's been compromised. This one, however, I do have a new bottle, and this bottle from the 70s, I think, of Paco Rabanne Pour Homme. And I do notice it isn't as mossy. It's more soapy. I think it's nice. I think the newer bottle's nice. I think it's a decent wear. I think that it hasn't been completely obliterated like maybe some have, but there is a difference. I don't really think it's up to me to tell people they must have an older version. You have to decide for yourself which one you enjoy. If the first one you ever wore was a more recent bottle and that's what's fulfilling you, then far be it from me to tell you to enjoy an older version of it. Unless you have that curiosity and you want to satiate that curiosity, then, check it out. There's many different versions of this. This is just one from the 70s, and there are many versions in between then and now. And Féminité de Bois. People argue that a lot of what made this such an iconic scent has been sullied up a little bit by reformulations once it went from Shiseido to Serge Lutens branding, that there were significant changes. I smelled the new version. I think it has a little bit less woodiness, a little bit less cedariness. It does seem a little bit less dimensional, but I don't think it's awful. I don't think it's still a pleasant wear. Pretty lucky to have this version of it. It's become pretty scarce, but yeah, I would throw this into the category of change. Maybe it's not a shell of its former self, but it feels a little different. And then something, like a citrus aromatic, like Capucci Pour Homme, Citrus Chypre. I had a newer bottle of this, and it had no legs whatsoever. I don't know if it was just I don't know. It was just whatever bottle I bought that was newer. Long ingredients. It seemed to last for about 30 minutes, and it was a very close to the skin kind of scent. Which in and of itself isn't the worst thing, especially if something is very citrus heavy. But it didn't really have much presence even for those first 30 minutes. However, morbid curiosity. Well, I don't know if it's morbid curiosity, but curiosity nonetheless. I had to. Morbid maybe because the fragrance is dying from reformulations. I had to get an older version of it just to see. And yeah, it's a huge difference. This is much more full, and the citruses sing for longer. And even with it being an older fragrance and citruses having this tendency to degrade over time, it just sings for much longer. It persists into the heart. There is a a noteworthy base, and yeah. So I can't really recommend newer bottles unless maybe I got some sort of dud formulation in between better ones. That's something to consider as well. So you have all these crazy batch code types who say, well, this batch wasn't so great, but the subsequent one was A-okay, and back to form, and then the next one, and so on and so forth. So one could argue that, this is not necessarily something that is linear. It's not like a linear decline. It does just get worse and worse and worse over time. Because then there are some things that I think actually improved. And while I don't have the bottle with me to grab right now, I am actually inclined to think that the 2000s reformulation of Dior Jules is an improvement on the original because of certain elements they add that gave it more interest than the older version. But I'm sure I would get some pushback for that because everybody has an opinion on this. There are going to be people who tell me that there's so many more that I should be talking about. Why didn't you mention this one or that one? And what about chorus? What about Antaeus? What about this? What about that? Because it's a debate, and I just really wanted to share the ones that I personally have definitively decided that they have been tampered and adversely affected over the years. So there you have it. That's my video on fragrances that seem to be a shell of their former selves. Oh, the shame, the travesty. Oh, it's really too bad, isn't it? Well, there are options here. You can get an older bottle, or in some fragrances, if you can't get an older bottle or you don't want to, just explore others that seem to have retained their beauty and their integrity. Or, I don't know, concentrate on newer fragrances. Who am I to tell you what you should and should not do in your fragrance journey? I'm just a guide. I'm just here to tell you my thoughts, my opinions, maybe educate you a little bit. And I love how the sun is coming in the way that it is right now as I have this spiel. But yeah, I thought it would be necessary to just kind of give like a little summary on the ones that I actually do think have been affected, and put a comment in the comment section. Ask me whatever you want. What do I think of this one or that one, and do I think that has been adversely affected, or do I think that current versions are just dandy? I can think of some. I still think that Aromatics Elixir smells great. I still think that Estee Lauder Youth do. All the Calons, like Yadigan, Le Tossium, Pour Homme, lots of Guerlain, lots of Chanel. But yeah, there's certainly others that I probably would think otherwise. I'm going to sign off now before the sun swallows me in a supernova. And tune in next time, and I will see you soon. Take care.